I never thought I would find myself in a courtroom, staring down the people who almost killed my father. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, especially when you are dealing with people drunk on the smallest amount of power imaginable. This is the story of how our homeowners association crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and how justice finally prevailed against those who thought themselves above the law. My father has always been my hero. At 90 years old, Richard Gardner remains one of the most dignified men I have ever known. A decorated veteran who served our country with unwavering dedication, he approaches life with the same discipline and honor that defined his military career. When my mother passed away 3 years ago, I made her a promise that I would look after him. It was not a burden but a privilege, a chance to repay a fraction of what he had given me throughout my life. After careful consideration, we decided that moving him closer to me made the most sense. His mind remained razor-sharp, but his body had begun to betray him. The wheelchair became a necessity after his second stroke, though he refused to let it define him. What he needed was a home that could accommodate his physical limitations while allowing him to maintain his independence, a delicate balance that meant everything to him. When I found the house on Oak Ridge Lane, it seemed perfect. A beautiful single-story home with wide doorways and a magnificent view of rolling hills and a small community pond. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, well-maintained, with sidewalks that would make it easy for him to navigate outdoors when the weather was nice. I remember our first visit to see the property, how his eyes lit up at the sight of the spacious backyard. "I could plant a garden here," he said, already mapping it out in his mind. "Tomatoes along that south-facing wall, maybe some herbs near the kitchen window." The realtor mentioned there was an HOA, but downplayed its significance. "They mostly handle the common areas and make sure property values stay high," she assured us. A few neighbors we met during our visits offered warm welcomes, though one elderly woman cryptically mentioned the rules people with a slight grimace. I did not think much of it at the time. Every community has its quirks and personalities, I reasoned. The day we moved him in was one of genuine joy. I watched him direct the movers with military precision, insisting that his books be arranged by subject matter rather than alphabetically, that his medals be placed just so on the mantel. Not out of vanity, but out of respect for what they represented. By sunset, he sat on his new porch, surveying his domain with contentment. "Your mother would have approved," he said quietly as I brought him a cup of tea. "This is a good place to spend my remaining years." I squeezed his shoulder, emotion catching in my throat. "You have got plenty of years left, Dad, and they are going to be good ones." How could I have known then that his new home would soon become a battleground? That his dignity would be under assault from those who valued property aesthetics over human decency? The peace we found would prove tragically temporary. 2 weeks after moving in, we made several minor modifications to accommodate my father's needs. Nothing extravagant. A small wooden ramp over the single front step, additional railings in strategic locations, and a simple flagstone path to the backyard so he could access his planned garden without navigating through grass that would impede his wheelchair. The changes were modest, practical, and as aesthetically pleasing as we could make them while keeping costs reasonable. The doorbell rang 3 days later. Standing on the porch were 3 people with expressions that ranged from neutral to openly disapproving. They introduced themselves as members of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board. Patricia Harrington stood at the center, a woman in her 60s with immaculately maintained silver hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. To her right was Malcolm Edwards, a retired attorney whose entire demeanor suggested he derived pleasure from finding technicalities to exploit. Completing the trio was Deborah Winters, who clutched a tablet and appeared to be documenting everything her eyes fell upon. "Mr. Gardner," Patricia began, addressing me rather than my father, who had wheeled himself to the door beside me. "We noticed you have made several unauthorized alterations to the exterior of your property." I explained they were necessary accommodations for my father's disability. Patricia's smile tightened. "We certainly understand the need for special considerations," she said, the word special carrying an unmistakable weight of condescension. "However, all exterior modifications require prior board approval. That is clearly stated in the covenants you signed." My father, ever the diplomat, intervened before I could respond, with the frustration building inside me. "I apologize for the oversight. We should have checked the rules more carefully. Perhaps we could submit the paperwork now, retroactively." Malcolm shook his head, his voice carrying the practiced precision of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Unfortunately, the approval process must precede any modifications. The board needs to review materials, dimensions, aesthetic impact on the neighborhood character. These modifications are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act," I interjected, watching Malcolm's expression flash with irritation at being challenged. "Reasonable accommodations for disabilities are legally protected rights." Patricia's posture stiffened noticeably. "Oak Ridge Estates certainly complies with all applicable laws, Mr. Gardner. However, even ADA accommodations must be properly vetted and approved through established procedures. Our community standards are what maintain our property values." Before departing, Deborah took several photos of the ramp and railings, her expression suggesting she was documenting crime scene evidence rather than mobility aids for a disabled veteran. Patricia assured us that official correspondence would follow regarding next steps. That evening, my father noticed my agitation as I prepared dinner. "They are just doing their job, son," he said, always willing to see the best in people. "We will work with them. No sense making enemies our first month here." I nodded, though something in my gut told me these were not reasonable people interested in finding accommodations. The interaction had carried too many undercurrents of control and disapproval. The next morning, an envelope appeared beneath our door, not mailed, not even knocked upon delivery, just silently slipped inside like some kind of summons. Inside was a formal notice of violation, citing 7 separate infractions beyond just the ramp and pathways. Apparently, the welcome mat was non-standard size, the brass door knocker, unapproved hardware, and the small American flag my father had placed near the ramp was an unauthorized display. The letter concluded with an invitation, more accurately, a demand to appear before the board at their next meeting to address these concerns. I felt my blood pressure rising as I read each petty violation. My father took the paper from my hands, adjusting his reading glasses to review it himself. "Interesting strategy," he mused, with the calm assessment of someone who had faced far worse adversaries than homeowners association bureaucrats. "They are overwhelming us with minor infractions to distract from the main issue, the accessibility modifications." His insight was correct, of course. This was not about brass knockers or welcome mats. This was about establishing dominance, about making it clear who controlled this community. It was becoming apparent that beneath the manicured lawns and coordinated exterior paint colors of Oak Ridge Estates lay something toxic, a culture of control wielded by those who confused community standards with personal fiefdoms. I attended the HOA meeting alone the following Tuesday, insisting my father stay home to rest after a physically taxing therapy session earlier that day. In truth, I did not want him to witness what I suspected would be an unpleasant confrontation. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building adjacent to the neighborhood pool. By the time I arrived, the room was already filled with residents seated in neat rows of folding chairs. Patricia called the meeting to order precisely at 7 o'clock, moving efficiently through agenda items with practiced parliamentary procedure. I noticed how several residents seemed to shrink in their seats when addressing the board, their postures reflecting an unspoken intimidation. When my name was called to address the violations, I approached the small podium at the front of the room with the documentation I had prepared. "Thank you for the opportunity to address these concerns," I began, keeping my tone professional despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I have brought detailed information regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act requirements as they pertain to residential properties. The modifications we have made are well within the scope of reasonable accommodations." I proceeded to distribute copies of the relevant ADA guidelines, along with photographs of our modifications with measurements clearly indicated. Patricia accepted her copy with 2 fingertips, as if handling something distasteful, while Malcolm did not even glance at the documents before setting them aside. "Mr. Gardner," Patricia responded with practiced patience, "while we appreciate your thoroughness, Oak Ridge Estates has its own established procedures for handling accommodation requests. Federal law does not supersede our community covenant requirements for prior approval." This statement was so blatantly incorrect that I momentarily struggled to respond. Malcolm seized the opening. "What Mrs. Harrington means is that the ADA requires reasonable accommodations, but reasonableness is determined through proper channels. Our architectural review process exists precisely to balance individual needs with community standards." The legal doublespeak was impressive in its audacity. I looked around the room, noting how several residents avoided eye contact. They had clearly witnessed this theater before. "To be clear," I said, addressing the room as much as the board, "you are suggesting that your approval process takes precedence over federal disability law, that a 90-year-old disabled veteran cannot have safe access to his own home until you approve the aesthetics of that access." A murmur rippled through the audience. Patricia rapped her gavel sharply. "There is no need for emotional appeals, Mr. Gardner. This is a matter of procedure. The board will vote on your unauthorized modifications now." The vote was a formality, unanimous rejection of our modifications with a requirement to remove them within 7 days or face daily fines of $100. As I gathered my ignored documentation, an older woman approached me hesitantly. "Do not take it personally," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no board members were watching. "They do this to everyone. The Smiths on Maple Court had to move last year after their request for a medical alert system antenna was denied. The fines bankrupted them." On my way out, another resident pressed a business card into my hand, a local attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. "You are not the first," he said under his breath, "but maybe you could be the last." Over the next few days, I conducted extensive research into the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. What I uncovered was disturbing. Financial records showed questionable bidding processes for community maintenance contracts, with work consistently awarded to companies with connections to board members. Multiple residents had been forced to move after sustained campaigns of selective enforcement. The board had been unchanged for 8 years, with elections procedurally manipulated to prevent new candidates from qualifying. My father noticed my distraction as I pored over documents at his kitchen table. "This is becoming an obsession, son," he observed. "Perhaps we should consider a compromise." Before I could respond, we noticed Patricia and Malcolm walking slowly past our house, stopping to take photographs. My father wheeled himself to the window, watching as they pointed at his newly planted garden beds, small raised planters I had built at wheelchair height so he could tend his tomato seedlings. "They are documenting the unauthorized landscape features," my father said quietly, a hint of defeat in his voice I had never heard before, not even during his most difficult physical therapy sessions. "Perhaps this was a mistake, moving here, creating trouble for you." Seeing my proud father diminished by these petty tyrants ignited something primal within me. "This is your home, Dad. You have earned the right to live with dignity. We are not backing down." What happened 3 days later would change everything. A moment of cruelty so shocking that it would ultimately lead to the HOA's downfall. I had left my father at home briefly to pick up his prescription from the pharmacy, a trip that should have taken 20 minutes at most. He had been in good spirits that morning, eager to spend time in his garden checking on his seedlings' progress. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too warm, ideal for him to be outside without risking overexertion. When I returned, the scene that greeted me defied comprehension. An ambulance was parked in our driveway, its lights flashing silently. 2 police cruisers blocked the street, and neighbors stood in clusters, hands covering mouths, eyes wide with shock. My heart nearly stopped as I ran toward the commotion, pharmacy bag dropping forgotten to the ground. A paramedic intercepted me before I could reach the ambulance. "Are you his son?" she asked, her expression grave but professional. "Yes, what happened? Where is my father?" My voice sounded strange, disconnected, as if coming from someone else. Officer Ramirez, whom I would come to know well in the following weeks, pulled me aside while the paramedics continued their work. "Your father was found in the community pond," he explained softly. "A teenager pulled him out. He is alive, but they are treating him for hypothermia and possible shoulder injury." Nothing made sense. The pond, that is nearly 100 yards downhill from our house, how would he? A woman interrupted, stepping forward from a group of witnesses. "It was them," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "The HOA people. They were removing his ramp when it happened." What emerged from witness statements and, crucially, security camera footage from both our house and neighboring properties was a sequence of events so callous it would later leave a courtroom in stunned silence. Patricia, Malcolm, and a third board member named Robert Chambers had approached our house while I was gone. Security footage showed them engaged in heated discussion with my father, who had wheeled himself to the edge of the porch. Robert and Malcolm began dismantling the wooden ramp, not merely documenting violations, but actively removing my father's access to his home. The camera captured my father's distress as he attempted to navigate back toward the door, only to find himself stranded as his exit was literally torn away. What happened next would be replayed countless times during the subsequent legal proceedings. Patricia gesturing dismissively toward the side of the property, Malcolm nodding, and Robert wheeling my father away from the porch toward the side yard. They positioned his wheelchair at the top of the gentle slope that led down toward the community pond. Whether what followed was intentional or the result of criminal negligence would be debated by attorneys, but the outcome was captured with horrifying clarity. The wheelchair was released, and my father began rolling uncontrolled down the hill. Jacob Miller, a 16-year-old neighbor, witnessed the incident while walking his dog. The security footage showed him sprinting across lawns as my father's wheelchair gathered speed, toppling when it hit the pond's muddy edge. Jacob dove into the water without hesitation, reaching my father, who was partially submerged and unable to free himself from the overturned chair. At the hospital, my father looked diminished in ways that transcended his physical injuries. Hypothermia had set in quickly, especially dangerous at his age. His shoulder was dislocated, requiring painful reduction. But it was the look in his eyes that haunted me, a profound humiliation and violation that cut deeper than any physical wound. "I did not think they would actually do it," he whispered hoarsely, his military bearing temporarily abandoned in the face of such betrayal. "Patricia said I was making a mockery of community standards, that my garden was an eyesore. When I told them to wait for you to return, Malcolm said they had legal authority to remove unauthorized structures immediately." I held his hand, rage and guilt warring within me. "I should never have left you alone with them." "You could not have known," he responded, a ghost of his usual strength returning. "No reasonable person could have anticipated this level of cruelty." That word, cruelty, crystallized everything. This was not about property values or community aesthetics. It was about power and the casual cruelty with which it had been wielded against an elderly disabled veteran whose only crime was wanting accessibility and a small garden. While my father recovered in the hospital, the community reaction was swift and definitive. The carefully cultivated fear that had kept residents silent began to crumble. Jacob's parents, respected longtime residents, were the first to step forward with documentation of their own battles with the board. Denied permissions, arbitrary fines, veiled threats. Others followed, each with stories that formed a damning pattern of abuse. Eleanor Simmons, a 78-year-old widow living 3 doors down, provided years of meticulous records detailing how the board had harassed her after she planted a memorial garden for her late husband. "They fined me for unauthorized plant species until I removed his favorite roses," she told me, her voice breaking. "I paid thousands in fines before giving in." William Forrest, a retired judge who lived at the corner property, became an unexpected ally. "I have watched their tactics for years but never had standing to intervene," he admitted, shame evident in his expression. "What they did to your father crossed a line that cannot be ignored. I have contacts in the district attorney's office who need to see this evidence." Patricia sent a flower arrangement to the hospital with a card describing the incident as a regrettable accident during a routine compliance inspection. Malcolm took a different approach, sending a community-wide email warning residents against spreading unfounded allegations that could damage community harmony and property values. Their attempts at damage control only added to the growing evidence of their consciousness of guilt. The security footage became our most powerful ally. Multiple camera angles from neighboring properties captured the deliberate nature of their actions. Jacob's testimony was equally damning. He had heard Patricia say, "Let him sit there until his son learns about following rules," just before the wheelchair began rolling downhill. My father, initially reluctant to pursue legal action, found new resolve as he learned about the HOA's history of targeting vulnerable residents. "This stopped being about me the moment I saw how many others they have hurt," he told me from his hospital bed, his military bearing returning. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you never saw coming, but that does not make them any less worth fighting." Within 2 weeks, formal charges were filed against Patricia, Malcolm, and Robert. The district attorney's office, presented with the overwhelming evidence, pursued criminal charges of elder abuse, reckless endangerment, and assault. Simultaneously, our civil attorney filed suit against not just the 3 board members, but the HOA as an entity for its pattern of discrimination and ADA violations. The legal proceedings unfolded with the deliberate pace of justice, sometimes frustratingly slow, but increasingly certain. The criminal trial began 4 months after the incident, by which time my father had physically recovered enough to attend each day, sitting tall in his wheelchair at the front of the courtroom, refusing to hide or be diminished by what had been done to him. The defense strategy quickly became apparent. Their attorneys attempted to paint my father as confused about what had transpired, suggesting he had rolled himself down the hill accidentally after becoming disoriented. They portrayed me as an opportunist, exploiting a misunderstanding to extract financial compensation. Patricia testified with practiced tears about her deep concern for community safety and how the unauthorized ramp had been a liability risk. Their narrative collapsed when the prosecution played the enhanced security footage. The courtroom fell silent as the deliberate positioning of the wheelchair was shown from multiple angles, followed by the clear moment of release. Jacob's testimony about what he had heard and witnessed earned him a spontaneous round of applause that the judge did not bother to silence. The most powerful moment came when my father took the stand. At 90 years old, Richard Gardner sat with perfect military posture, his voice unwavering as he recounted not just the incident but the systematic harassment that had preceded it. "I have faced enemy fire in defense of American freedoms," he stated, looking directly at the defendants. "I never imagined I would have to defend my right to access my own home on American soil." When the defense attorney suggested he might have been confused about who had moved his wheelchair, my father fixed him with a stare that had once commanded respect from generals. "Young man, my body may be compromised, but my mind and my honor are intact. I know exactly what happened that day, who was responsible, and why they did it. They believed themselves powerful enough to act without consequences. They were mistaken." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia and Malcolm received jail sentences, 18 months and 12 months respectively, while Robert, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received probation and community service. The civil case was settled shortly thereafter, resulting in substantial damages that reflected not just the incident but the pattern of discrimination established by numerous victim testimonies. But the most significant outcome was not the punishment of wrongdoers, but the transformation of our community. The HOA board was dissolved by court order and replaced with an interim committee tasked with creating new bylaws. I was asked to serve, alongside Aliner, Jacob's father, and 3 other residents committed to rebuilding governance based on inclusivity rather than control. Our first official act was to approve comprehensive accessibility standards that prioritized accommodations for all residents with disabilities or mobility challenges. Our second was to establish a community garden in the area near the pond, dedicated in my father's name, transforming the site of his humiliation into a place of community pride and gathering. 1 year after the verdicts, the changes in Oak Ridge Estates are profound. The new HOA, elected through transparent processes, includes representatives from all sectors of our community, including seniors and residents with disabilities. The bylaws have been completely rewritten to emphasize community enhancement rather than restriction and punishment. 3 neighboring HOAs have requested copies of our new governance model as a template for their own reforms. My father has found unexpected purpose in his role as community elder. Each Tuesday, He hosts an open gardening clinic from his wheelchair, teaching neighbors everything from proper tomato pruning to companion planting techniques. The teenager who saved him, Jacob, received the first annual Community Hero Scholarship we established from a portion of the settlement funds. Most significantly, state legislators have taken notice of our case. Last month, I testified before the State Assembly in support of Bill 4372, which would strengthen oversight of homeowners associations and enhance protections for homeowners with disabilities. My father sat in the gallery, watching as I explained how one community's darkness was transformed into light. When the bill, informally known as the Gardner Act, passed unanimously, he wheeled himself to my side as reporters gathered for comments. A journalist asked what this victory meant to him personally. In the military, my father responded with quiet dignity, we understood that the measure of justice is not merely punishing wrongdoing, but creating systems where such wrongs become impossible. What happened to me was terrible, but what has grown from it is beautiful. That is the true meaning of justice. Later that evening, as we sat together on his fully accessible porch overlooking the community garden where residents of all ages work together, I realized that we had achieved something more powerful than revenge. We had created change that would outlast us both. My father, reading my thoughts as he often does, patted my hand. The best revenge against darkness, he said, smiling as children played near his namesake garden, is creating light that no one can extinguish.